Cathy Saunders. She's here from Putnam Investments to give us a little presentation to start off afternoon hours.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
How'd it go finishing things up down there?
Good.
Good? Excellent. I'm going to pass around some folders. We're going to dive right in. We had 40 minutes, but I think it actually is going to end up being 30 minutes. So if you don't mind, we're going to dive right in. And I've got some folders, especially for the bleacher seats back there, which always
We're calling them the keep seats.
the cheap seats, okay. Excellent. Well, it is an absolute honor to be here. My name, as Natalie said, is Cathy Saunders from Putnam Investments. I came in yesterday from Boston, Massachusetts, but I had the distinct honor of living out here for 18 years. So this is like coming back to Mecca and coming back home again. Maybe I can start out with a little bit of a story, just to sort of set the stage, if you don't mind. You know, one of the things that I do in my role at Putnam is I travel a lot. So usually throughout the week, I'm traveling all over mostly the US. And on weekends, I love to kind of take a step back for just a minute. And if there's one day that I can count on, it's usually Sunday that I'm going to be home. And that's usually when I get all my business done, right? Personal stuff, just catching up on the errands and so forth. But there's one thing that I absolutely, positively love to do. And there's nothing that feels better than curling up on the couch with a copy of the New York Times and just picking through it. Anybody else like that? You're sitting around the table, picking through it. And yes, I do read it in hard copy still. There's something about it. And I use it as an opportunity to catch up on all those things that I might have missed throughout the week. So a few years back, I'm looking through the New York Times. And ladies, there are a few seats up here if you want to kind of pull them around, feel free. There was an article that I saw in the New York Times, and I caught it in the sports section, which, truth be told, isn't a place that I spend too much time in. But I caught it in the sports section. It was a story about a 13-year-old girl by the name of Natalie Gilbert, who was given the distinct honor of singing the national anthem at an NBA playoff game. And given the fact that it's playoff season, right? This happened several years ago. It was a huge night for this girl. It was a game between the Dallas Mavericks and the Portland Trail Blazers. And for those of you who've been to Portland or maybe from Portland, it was played at the Rose Garden. So capacity at the Rose Garden is somewhere around, I don't know, 25,000 fans, something like that. It was a huge night. Her parents were there, her entire family was there. She was dressed in her Sunday best. She was down courtside, ready to roll, and her cue, per se, was as the lights went down, she was supposed to make her way out to center court, and that was the time that she was supposed to go. So, as you can imagine, a big playoff game, there was a lot going on, there was so much noise you could barely hear yourself think, talk, what have you. But sure enough, the lights came down, right? Natalie made her way out to center court. She looked around the arena. She raised the microphone to the bottom of her chin. She opened her mouth, and nothing. The words to the national anthem were stuck in her throat. 1 second went by. 2 seconds went by. 3 seconds went by. And a guy by the name of Maurice Cheeks, who then was the coach of the Portland Trail Blazers, got up off the bench, went out to center court, wrapped his right arm around Natalie Gilbert, raised his left hand to the rafters, and that night helped Natalie Gilbert sing the national anthem with her in his arms. Thousands of people were watching, obviously, at the Rose Garden. Thousands of people were watching on TV. And I share that story because I think it means a couple of things. I think it demonstrates a couple of things. First and foremost, the character, right, of this guy by the name of Maurice Cheeks. He didn't have time to think, did he? And how many of you are parents? How many of you have daughters? Can you imagine how long those 3 seconds were for your child, right? So, for one thing, I think it talks a lot about character. The second thing that it talks about is leadership. And what Maurice Cheeks did that night was exactly what leaders do. So in the next 25 minutes, what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about leadership, talk a little bit about the concept of leadership, so that all of us can continue to lead in our personal lives. But I also would like to leave you with a framework to think about another life that we have, and that is leading in meeting our goals for our financial future, and provide a little bit of framework, some context, and some things to think about that as well. You know, not too long ago, I had an opportunity to get exposed to some writings and some learnings from a guy by the name of Howard Gardner. I learned these at Northwestern University, Kellogg in Evanston, Illinois. There was a women's leadership course that I took over a one-year period. And Howard Gardner was one of the subjects of one of the talks that I participated in. Some of you might have heard about his work in the past. He's a Harvard professor, lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, has about 29 honorary degrees. Boy, it's a full-time job, getting 29 of those, right? Yeah, he's written about 20 books. And he studied a lot of things, but one of the things that I found most fascinating to me was the work that he did on this whole concept of leadership. And what he did, he was passionate about history, passionate about politics when he grew up. But the one thing that he did is he always found himself studying leaders. Leaders across a variety of different industries, leaders across a variety of different disciplines, walks of life, and so on. Some of the subjects you know very well. Eleanor Roosevelt is one. Martin Luther King. Margaret Mead, who's a world-renowned anthropologist, as many of you know. Martha Graham, who's the 20th century icon and choreographer. Margaret Thatcher, how many of you saw or read the book Iron Lady, right? She, as you know, was Prime Minister of England from 1979 to 1990. Gandhi, the list goes on. Every single one of the subjects who he studied changed and challenged the status quo. Changed and challenged the status quo. But much of what he studied and much of his journey was just learning about their stories, the stories of their lives, right? The stories of how they grew up, the story about how they developed their passions. So the one question that comes out of a lot of what he did was, you know, if you were to take a look at all of those leaders and all the entire body of his work, bless you, the entire bodies of his work, what's the one question that you might have on your mind? Are there any common threads? Are there any things that are consistent amongst this very diverse group of leaders? Come to find out, and he writes about it in his book. I have books for everybody here if you'd like to take one. I know you're loaded down with a few of them today, which is not a bad thing, right? But as you take a look at the question of were there any common threads, there were. As a matter of fact, there were 5 things that came up consistently as common characteristics amongst all of these leaders, and I wanted to share the 5 things with you. Number 1, which actually is very appropriate for, I think, what the broader theme of today is all about, which is taking a little bit of time for ourselves, right? Time of reflection. The first thing that every single one of these leaders did is they took time to reflect. They did it consistently. They didn't do it every once in a while, just when it was convenient for them. They took time out every single day to reflect. For some, it was a run on the beach. For others, it was a little bit of yoga. For some really busy people, just spending a few extra minutes in the shower. And what happened was these leaders found that it gave them an opportunity to turn up the volume and turn down the noise. They found that by combining the extremes of total isolation, just being by themselves, yet also combining that with total immersion in their craft and what they were great at, really made the difference. And it really gave them, as already is happening to me personally today, gave them an opportunity to step away and see how all the things that happened throughout the day built out into a broader mosaic along the way. So this uncluttered sense of reality and taking time to reflect really made the difference. So the first thing that came up was taking time to reflect. One of the things at Putnam that we're a sponsor of is the U.S. ski team. And one of the greatest conversations that we had with the head of high performance at the U.S. ski team, his name is Troy Taylor, he talked about what a gold medalist skier, and how they allocate their time. I want to write down these numbers because it's fascinating in terms of this whole concept of reflection. A gold medalist on the U.S. ski team spends 15% of their time training, 0.0005% of their time competing, 0.00002 time at the Olympics, and 85% of their time recovering. Doesn't that put things in perspective? Think about that. The best in the business, right? The best in the business. So, number one, took time to reflect. Number two, they leveraged their strengths. They leveraged their strengths. Each and every one of them knew what they were good at, but they also knew what they weren't good at. They didn't get hung up on things that they weren't good at, and they channeled their energies to where their gift was. How many of you just say to yourself, and we're constantly working at it, you know, these are the things that I need to improve on, these are the things that I have to do better, right? It's great to keep on learning. That's what this session, this day is all about. But in terms of where they spent their passionate time, they spent it in the areas that they were strong in. And they aligned it with their natural ability and didn't get caught up. Didn't spend 1 minute worrying about the things that they weren't good at. And they took another step and they sought out opportunities to go ahead and leverage those strengths along the way. So number two is leverage their strengths. Number three, really interesting. Every single one of them was a great storyteller. You know, the thing that I love about today is how many great stories have we heard along the way. They had a life that was a life of a narrative, a life of a story that they kept on compounding and building on along the way. They didn't seek out power for power's sake. They sought out power more as a platform to be evangelists for their story and to influence what? To influence thinking along the way. So they all told a great story. Number four, they learned from experience. Remember getting your first job? You can't get your first job unless you have experience, and you can't get experience without your first job. That was a crazy place to be, right? But each and every one of them, they learned from experience. Do you know every single one of them remembered their first job? But more importantly, as an extension of that, they remember what they learned from that first job. They remember what they learned from that first job, no matter how big or small it was. They had a learning experience from every single thing that they did. Fifth thing I think is so fitting and appropriate. Each and every one of them did not do it alone. Every single one of them went through periods of self-doubt. People call it a number of different things. Losing your moxie, losing your mojo, just feeling out of sync for a minute. But every single one of them doesn't necessarily have to be a spouse, a significant other, or what have you, but every single one of them had somebody in their life who they could lean on, and somebody in their life who was in an unwavering way in their corner. And at that time and period of self-doubt, they said one thing, you know what, you're not crazy. You're not crazy, keep on going, keep on going. So those are the 5 things that came up. You know, one of the things that I love, not to get back to the New York Times, but one of the things I love that the New York Times does this time of year, because it's almost May and June, and it's commencement season, right? And they do quick snapshots of some of the greatest commencement speeches that go on. And I love that because usually there's just such insight in some of those works. Last year, Tim Cook, since we're on the subject of technology today, Tim Cook, as you know, CEO of Apple, presented at George Washington University. And it's funny because as you think about all those leaders who I just mentioned, every single one of them, another thing that they all had in common is they put themselves out there in the arena every single day. They put themselves out in the center of traffic to influence people in a positive way and have a positive impact. I think Tim Cook had a great quote on the subject, and he said, "Great progress is possible no matter what line of work you choose. The sidelines are not where you want to live your life. The world needs you in the arena." We've met a lot of people in the arena today, starting with the people sitting around this table. No matter what you do, the world needs your energy, your passion, your impatience with progress. History rarely yields itself to one person. But think and never forget what happens when it does. That can be you. That should be you. That must be you. I thought it was a great quote on leadership and some of the things that he brings to the table into his business every single day. So how does that backdrop of leadership and your continued journey in your personal lives and what you think about there lead to this whole subject of the journey that we all face with our money? Bless you. One of the things that I did want to pass along is a framework, some perspective, some context to bring together some of the things that have been presented today. And I think it always makes sense to present it in the context of challenges and opportunities. Maybe I can break this piece of the talk down into two different parts, the good news and the bad news. When I think of, and I don't know about you, but whenever I hear those two subjects, I always want to get the bad news out of the way first before talking about the good news. So with your permission, maybe I'll start there. So what's the bad news when it comes to facing your money? There are four things, four challenges, and one of these in particular for women. Theo talked about it first thing out of the gate this morning. But there are four things that take money out of our pockets each and every day. First thing is taxes. Quick question for all of you. How many of you think taxes are going down? It's always a great way to find out if I showed up at the right room or not. So tax is pretty obvious. In fact, I think it was Sam who spent a little bit of time talking about the national debt and the challenges that we had there. Well, one of the ways that the national debt is solved is through what? Through the contribution that we make every single day, right? Second challenge that we face is something called inflation. What's inflation all about? What's inflation all about? Any idea?
Cost of goods.
Cost of goods, right? Let me ask you this. What's the furthest back that you can remember what a price of a postage stamp was?
6 cents.
10 cents, 6 cents.
Yeah, 11.
Some people say penny postcards. I don't know if I was around penny postcards, but probably not too far off, that's for sure. It's all, did you know that actually, I think for the first time in history, postage stamps went down this month? From 49 cents, I think it's to 47. Interesting little, and that's not a forever stamp, I don't think, but I could be wrong. But that's the first time, to my recollection, that happened. But inflation is all about that decline in purchasing power. Theo mentioned this morning. As women, right, have a longer life expectancy than men do, on average. Averages can be dangerous sometimes, but if we've got a longer lifespan, we've got to make sure that our money grows in order for it to last, right? It's a decline in purchasing power over time. The other thing is science, medicine, and technology, listen to the dialogue that we're having today, right? Is keeping us around a lot longer than we ever expected. When I grew up, I thought my grandmother at age 60 was old. You know, the type of person who would never go to the grocery store and buy green bananas because she wasn't going to, you never knew if she was going to be around. Right? 60 today is not old. 60 today is middle age, isn't it? Especially for this crowd, for this group, right? If you take a look, watch on a weekend when you go to the airport. There are men and women who are hopping on airplanes with golf clubs, tennis rackets, and everything else, right? And they're 60, 70, 80 years old. So inflation is all about doing just that, keeping up with your purchasing power over time. Third thing that takes money out of our pockets is low interest rates. There is a chart in your packages. I won't reference it, but I'll give you a little bit of a graph. Low interest rates take money out of our pocket. If you were going to take a look at a chart of where interest rates have been, way back as long as I can remember, the chart would look something like this. When were rates really high? The 80s. Gosh, that didn't take too long at all. I can remember this distinctly because I was looking for a job in 1983. Don't do the math, please. In 1983, as I was graduating from college, you could get a certificate of deposit, ladies, for 15, 16, 17% at that time. But rates have traditionally been low at levels that we're at right now, and even lower. Some people say, well, when are the good old days going to come back? I don't know if you remember the gas lines that we had in the 70s and so forth. I don't know if I would necessarily, and inflation, I don't know if I would necessarily call those the good old days, but people say, are we going to see these days again? Is it possible? Anything's possible. We do have to be fair, right? But is it probable? I'd say probably not. Okay. Fourth thing that takes money out of our pocket, I would argue that this one in particular is bigger then this microphone is going to go down my pants and just is something near and dear to my heart, and it's called procrastination. I hope I got that spelling right. How many of you are familiar with phrases like shoulda, woulda, coulda, mañana? Put another way, how many of you have 80 to 90 projects in the garage that you're going to get to someday, right? It's all about procrastination. Realistically, why do people procrastinate when it comes to their money? Anybody know?
Don't know what to do with it.
Don't know what to do. Confusion, and what's the other thing?
Fear.
Fear. You said fear.
Fear.
Right here. Absolutely. Fear, right? What's your biggest fear when it comes to your money?
Losing it.
Losing it. Pretty simple, right? Losing it. Those are the two things, the two reasons why people procrastinate with their money. And every day that goes by, doesn't matter if you sleep in late, get up early, those four things are still taking money out of your pockets. 10 minutes. Okay. So, what's the good news? The good news in the last 10 minutes, thank you, Natalie, keeping us on time. The good news is there's only 3 things that you can do with your money. One is to put your money in what we call taxable accounts. What's a good example of a taxable account? CDs, right? Savings accounts, right? Bonds, you bet. Absolutely. The second thing is tax-deferred accounts. What's a good example of a tax-deferred account? IRAs, 401ks. When do you pay taxes on a tax-deferred account? Later, when you pull it out, right? Third way to invest your money is in what we call tax-free accounts. What's a good example of a tax-free account?
Munis?
Munis, exactly. 401k, I would put in tax-deferred.
What about Roth?
Oh, you got it. Perfect. So the question is, that's pretty simple. We're talking about this framework. We talked about the challenges. Now we talked about the solutions. There's only 3. What's the easiest question that you could ask? What's the easiest question? Which one is best, right? Which one is best out of all 3 of those?
Tax-free.
All of them.
The bleacher seats over to the right here.
Done my homework.
You know what? You could say one of all 3 of these things. And the real answer is it depends. If you remember anything of this about this framework, it depends. Depends on 2 things. Number 1, what your financial destination is. And secondly, how fast or slow you want to go in order to get there. Some people feel more comfortable driving 35 miles an hour. Some people like to drive 55 miles an hour, some over the speed limit. It depends. It depends. I do want to spend 2 minutes on this whole notion of fear, though. Because if the decline in our purchasing power over time is, as women, one of our biggest challenges, we have to say, what is one of the best investments that you can make to combat inflation, right? And does anybody know the answer to that? What is the best investment you can make to combat inflation? I'm sorry?
I said something about health.
You,
Is that right?
That's, well, health is actually, that's a very interesting question. That falls under inflation because we're staying around a lot longer. But what's the best investment to combat inflation? Gold? Actually, not historic, from a historic perspective. It's stocks. This is the Honesty Club. When you think of stocks, what do you think of? Risk. What else? Thank you.
Reward.
Reward, okay. Don't get that a lot, but a lot of people think of risk. You want reward, absolutely, but people think of losing their money. They think of risk. You know why? Because most of the people who we work with, and including me, have a bigger fear of being poor rather than a desire for being rich. If that applies to you, raise your hand.
Is that mostly with women, though, more than men?
It's both.
Okay.
That is a great question. Most of the people who we work with, ask you, have a bigger fear of being poor rather than a desire for being rich. So let's take a look at a stock account, and let's take a look at how founded our fear is, and let's take a look at how they work, right? So here's a picture of an account, somewhere in here. Right here, I tapped it. Here's a picture of an account. If you had it in 1957, put in $10,000, it grew to $3.8 million, an average rate of return of 11.2% a year. How does that sound? Pretty good, right? But guess what? You're absolutely right. There's volatility. It's not 11% each and every year. As a matter of fact, it seems very high, doesn't it? That's on average. This is a, call it 55-mile-an-hour growth fund. It's called a growth and income fund. But here are the returns since 1981, right? And I want you to walk through the rhythm of this for just 1 minute with me for a second. 1981, the return of this account was 2.85%. If you saw your statement show down 2.85%, what would you say?
Yeah.
Get me out, right? Get me out. But look what happened the next 2 years, up 22%, up 21%, right? Then came, what is this, 1984, another so-so year, right? You could probably have done much better in certificates of deposit and only gave you a rate of return of 5.39%, right? But look what happened, and you probably said the same thing, get me out, right? This is too volatile. Look what it did in 85 and 86. Then came 1987. I'm looking around the room. There were people around here in 1987. What happened in 1987? You got it, Black Monday. Remember Black Monday? One of the biggest drops in history. What did the account do? It was down 2.43%. What did you say? You called up Theo, oh my gosh, get me out, right? Look what happened in 88 and 89. 1990, another tough year, 2.39%. Look what happened in 91, 92, 93, 94, another, call it flat year. As you take a look, this rhythm continues. This rhythm continues. There are 3 things that you want to keep in mind in your framework in an investment, because sometimes, one of the biggest challenges is not the behavior of the account, but it's the behavior of what?
Investor.
The investor. Thank you. The investor. For all reasons that we understand, there are 3 things that you need to know. There are 3 T's of successful investing. The first thing is you have to have the first T, which is time. You've got to have time on your side, right? Investing for the long haul, right? In your packages, it'll show you how important that timing is. If you miss some of the best days in the market, you're only subtracting from your own returns. The second thing is talent. You've got to find the right talent to invest your money, for sure. And the third T is temperament. The third thing is temperament. Having a perspective. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. Perspective along the way. So what should you be thinking about now? What should you be thinking about now? There are 4 things that I'd like you to consider. Number 1, don't forget to diversify. We all know the old adage, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Not one investment is going to get you to where you're going. If you want a picture of that in your packages for you to take home, is the reason why, in terms of your diversification, that you absolutely should take a look at international types of companies. We are a global economy. Just look around us, right? A global economy. Half of the opportunities, investment opportunities out there are located, guess where? Outside the United States. That's number 1. Number 2, don't hold short-term investments responsible for meeting long-term goals. Don't hold short-term investments responsible for meeting long-term goals. What do I mean? A certificate of deposit is a great thing, but it's not going to get you to where you're going in terms of filling up your bucket of financial security for where you want to go in the future. Thirdly, dollar cost average. Does anybody know what dollar cost averaging means? It means pay yourself first. It means invest periodically and consistently over time. Some days you go to the supermarket and tuna fish is at $1 a can. Albacore is at $3. And if you go to Whole Foods, it could be 4 or 5, right? My prices could be off. But remember the days when you could go in and you saw you could get 2 cans for $1? It's a long time ago. But nonetheless, what did you think? You'd say, gosh, how many tuna fish sandwiches am I going to have in the next 6 months? And what do? Buy as many as you can. This is the only business when you invest your money, when things go on sale, people panic. Think about that. Think about that. Last thing is kind of where we started. That is, don't do it alone. Don't do it alone, because if you take a look at where stocks have been on average over a long period of time, 10, 20, 30 years, the S&P, the Dow, you pick your time frame, is in double-digit territory, 10, 12%, something like that, right? But the average American investor in their own portfolio has only gotten a return, because if left to their own devices, of about 5%. Why? Because they were getting in at the wrong time, out at the wrong time, and forgot about that long-term perspective. For those of you who walked in this morning at 8:30, you saw the same thing I did out here. There was fog all over the place, wasn't there? You remember that? Yeah. And I don't know what time it was exactly, but it might have been 11 o'clock, and I look out, oh my gosh, one of the greatest sights on the planet Earth, called the Golden Gate Bridge, right? The water looks tremendous. Perspective is really, really important in this business. I had a friend who had a child go to college lately, and they wrote a letter. She wrote a letter to her parents, and I wanted to share the letter with you. Dear Mom and Dad, since I left for college, I've been remiss in writing to you, and I'm sorry for my negligence. I'll bring you up to date, but before you read on, please sit down. You're not really ready until you're seated. Well, I'm getting along okay now. The skull fracture and the concussion I got when I jumped out of the dormitory window after I set the dormitory on fire shortly after I arrived is pretty well healed now. I spent only 2 weeks in the hospital and can see almost normally now, and those sick headaches are coming only once a day. Fortunately, the fire in the dorm and my jump were witnessed by a gas station attendant. He was the one who called for the fire department and the ambulance, and he visited me every day in the hospital. Since I had nowhere to live because of my burnt-out dorm, he was kind enough to let me share his apartment. It's just a basement room, but it's kind of cute. He's a very fine man, and we've fallen deeply in love and are planning to get married. We haven't set a date yet, but it'll be before my pregnancy starts. Yes, Mom and Dad, I'm pregnant. I know how much you'll be looking forward to welcoming the baby and giving it the same love and care as you did me when I was a child. The reason for the delay in the marriage is that my fiance is awaiting parole. I know you'll welcome him into our family with open arms. He's kind and although not well educated, he's very ambitious. Although he's from a different religion than ours, I know your oft-repeated tolerance will not permit you to be bothered by that in any way. Now that I've brought you up to date, I want to tell you that there was no dormitory fire. I had no jump, there's no concussion, and there's no skull fracture. I'm not in the hospital, I'm not pregnant, and I'm not engaged. And there's no boyfriend in my life. However, I'm getting a D in history and an F in science. I wanted you to see those marks in proper perspective. If there's anything that you take away from this conversation as leaders in your life and as leaders in managing for your future financial security, make sure that you have perspective. It's so important. We're not in a world where what's most recent is the most relevant, and there's no one who provides that perspective, that backdrop, that mosaic better than Theo does, that's for sure. Thank you for having me, and I look for
We've got 10 more minutes.
Oh, great!
So if you want to answer any questions.
10 more minutes. Ladies, any questions? Yes.
I was just wondering, when you have the time, the talent, and the temperament,
Yes.
that the talent is a hard thing for people to judge.
Yes.
And so I wondered if you had anything to say.
Well, you take a look at Theo, one of the things that she does, and she has a very robust process. Now, can I just say one thing on the books? You have so much to carry with you. For those of you who like to take these now, feel free to take them. If you want me to send them to you, I will absolutely send them to you. Just give me I've got plenty of the right talent in terms of the investments that you make in your portfolio. That is what we call research, and that is something that is extremely important. And I won't speak for Theo, but I can tell you that a few things that she probably looks at are track record, pedigree, returns, tenure in the business, and most importantly, performance over time. Theo, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, so, coming from the investment consulting side of the business, which I helped build back in the early 90s, meant that we went out on the street, and I always say I'm agnostic, because you have to be able to have no precious interest, whether it's the firm you work for or the entity that you're looking at. And what it really boils down to is taking the investment apart and being able to understand what it's made out of, what it looks like under certain market conditions and certain business cycles, and then understanding what we call the upside down capture ratio. So all this stuff goes on behind when you're analyzing who you're working with. And so, there's a panacea in some ways. People are like, oh, are all funds created equal? No, they're not. They're all different. Are all indexes created the same? They're not. You have to understand the construction of what's going on inside each of those entities. So even at Morgan Stanley, I mean, there's over 30,000 different investment managers out there. So you go through a tracking process to eliminate really down to the top 1%. Because what happens is there'll be style drift, which has to do with an entity that might be, and this happened a lot, when you get into markets like last year, the FANGs, you didn't have Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google last year, you weren't going to outperform the index. So you have to figure out what the majority interest are in some of these portfolios and understand that everything is like a sine curve. You have a positive, the value of growth depending on what year it is, and it all gets to the same place over time. The most dangerous thing you can do is A, not do your research of who you're going to work with, B, change in the middle of the stream, like a horse crossing stream. If you start changing what you're investing in, you're going to make mistakes. Average person in the United States does less than 2% over time in their returns because they're always picking up Money Magazine or they're not doing their research. Robos can't do that. Anyway, that's my pitch. I didn't know I was going to walk in here. Now I know where all the people are. I must be doing a good job.
We missed you, Theo.
You're missing. You're missing.
You must have heard part of it because you just reinforced a few concepts that we were talking about.
Thank you. I'm glad you did that, but I was trying to find where everybody was. There were 2 rooms, and you're all in here. So she's fabulous. I appreciate you doing that. I'm going to slip out again because I'm getting embarrassed.
The only reason I was able to answer all those questions is because Theo has been my mentor, teacher, advisor, and everything else. And when I walked into her office many years ago, I knew nothing. So,
Great. That's
I
an
wasn't
educator at heart.
yeah.
That's right. I'd be a teacher if I wasn't doing this.
You know-
So I'm going to sleep out, get out again because I'm embarrassed.
Thank you. Natalie, can we take one more? or-
Yes. The egg room.
Yes,
really.
please.
Yeah,
Although
they show that women are better investors in the studies, but that obviously if you're not investing, you can't do better. What would be your top piece of advice to women who have this fear about investing to jump in and get more educated and involved and have more confidence?
Barbara, it is a fantastic question, and actually you just answered it. And that is to jump in and get engaged. It's one of those things where, and it goes for anything in our lives, if there's an issue that needs to be tackled, sometimes you just say, wait, if I just wait long enough, will it go away? This, unfortunately, is not one of those things. And clearly, Kimberly, I think took a great route. And
Yeah, I
you
didn't
can
even know
answer
what
that.
question to ask her, and I had become divorced, so therefore single, running a small business, which I had to ramp up because I became single. I had a couple of health issues. I, was totally freaked out about taking over all of this and planning, and then I just, turned 65, and you got to figure out then what happens. And anyway, Theo's been with me for, all along, and I still get scared, but if I get too scared, then I just call him up and talk about things, and I'm reassured and
That is
pay
the
myself
answer.
first.
The thing is that partnership.
Yeah.
If I may, is having that partnership, and a partnership that starts with trust. And it is interesting that we are here at the Women's Intelligence Trust in the Orange Zone, which I didn't know that about Orange, but I'm going to buy a lot of Orange stuff now. So I can use all the help I could get, but that's where I would start. You have to have a partner. It's just like, I am not a doctor. I need help as it relates to health questions and so forth. And my primary physician is somebody who I rely a lot on. And by having that transparency and that partnership, that alone helps alleviate the fears that are natural.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies. Please take these books.